Welcome to the History Guy podcast, Counterfactuals. What is a counterfactual? In the context of studying history, it is a kind of analysis where we examine what might have happened had historical events gone differently. As a thought experiment, the goal is to learn and understand history as it is by talking about what it could have been. As a twist on the historical stories that we tell on the History Guy YouTube channel, this is a series of podcasts that dwell on that eternal question: what if? I'm Josh, a writer for the YouTube channel and son of the History Guy. If you're a fan of the channel, you already know Lance, the History Guy himself. To liven up our discussions on what might have happened, we have invited Brad Wagnon, history aficionado and a longtime friend of the History Guy, to join us. Remember that if you'd like to support us, you can find us on Patreon, YouTube, and locals.com. Join us as we discuss what deserves to be remembered and what might have been. On today's episode, we travel to 1943 and one of the earliest battles American soldiers fought with Nazi Germany in the mountainous regions of Tunisia. There, the fortuitous arrival of artillery stemmed the tide after German forces broke through American defenses at Kasserine Pass. But what might have happened if it all went differently? Without further ado, let me introduce the History Guy.
Following their defeat at the Battle of Kasserine Pass in Tunisia in North Africa on February 20th, 1943, the American army was in headlong, disorganized retreat. The battle represented the first major engagement between American troops and Axis troops in the Second World War, and it was a significant defeat for the Americans. Now, historians have tended to talk about the significance of the Battle of Kasserine Pass in terms of the important reforms that were forced upon the U.S. Army as a result of the defeat. But that perspective ignores a frightening fact, and that is the battles around Kasserine Pass also offered the possibility of a war-changing setback for the Allies. But immediately following the defeat at Kasserine Pass, there was an astounding stand in front of the Tunisian town of Thala. And while the Battle of Thala is usually seen as not much more than an afterthought in terms of the larger battles around Kasserine Pass, in fact, it was a valiant and unlikely defense that prevented a disaster for the Allies. And so today I'd like to take some time to appreciate the unlikely and underappreciated defense of Thala on February 21st and 22nd, 1943. The American Army had landed in French Morocco in November of 1942 during Operation Torch and had met only light resistance. By January of 1943, they were pushing through Tunisia, intent on cutting off the German supply at the port city of Tunis. The German commander, Field Marshal Irwin Rommel, decided that he would attack the massing Allied American, French, and British troops. His goal was not just to blunt their expected attack on Tunis, however. Rommel thought that he had the opportunity to take advantage of the green American forces and force a breakthrough that would give him access to the Allied supply depots in Algeria, which would have been an event that could have changed the course of the war in North Africa. Initial attacks by the Afrika Korps and the 5th Panzer Army threw back the Allied lines more than 50 miles and made them defend just a few passes between Tunisia and Algeria. And on February 19th and 20th, Rommel's forces shattered the Americans who were defending a place called Kasserine Pass. The Axis victories to that point had a lot to do with an untested American army that made significant operational and coordination errors in the face of veteran German and Italian troops. Kasserine Pass was seen as a significant defeat for the Americans that highlighted the need to make significant organizational changes. But Kasserine Pass itself did not open the road to the Allied supply depots in Algeria. But Rommel recognized the opportunity and immediately made a dash with the powerful 10th Panzer Division for the Tunisian town of Thala and its critical crossroads. You have to understand the importance of the Tunisian town of Thala. While it's just a small mountain town, it controlled crossroads that go both north into the rest of Tunisia and west into Algeria. Had Rommel taken those crossroads, he would have been able to cut off thousands of American troops that were trying to regroup to the north. Cut off from supply, that would have forced a surrender of significant Allied forces. But even more, that would have left open the western road, which could have allowed Rommel to take the supply depots in Algeria and use those as a base to drive the Americans out of their bridgehead in North Africa. Simply put, Thala was critical. But Thala was only defended by remnants of shattered American forces that had been defeated at Kasserine Pass and some detached elements of the British Sixth Army. As the American tanks had all been destroyed or abandoned at the Battle of Kasserine, the only armor that the Allies had to defend the pass against the powerful tanks of the 10th Panzer Division were a few units of British Valentine tanks, which were outdated. And there was nothing else. There were no Allied reserves to reinforce Thala. That's all that faced down Rommel and the 10th Panzer Division. Thala was surrounded by a group of defensible ridge lines, and the troops of the British 26th Armoured Brigade, regiments of the 17th and 21st Lancers, and the Derbyshire Yeomanry defended each ridge line valiantly. But their Valentine tanks were outgunned, and they could only defeat the German tanks at point-blank range. And slowly they were pushed back, ridgeline by ridgeline, losing ever more of their dwindling supply of Valentine tanks. They barely held on through the day of the 21st, and then were attacked again at night. The Germans decided upon a night attack and a ruse. They led their attack with a captured British Valentine tank that fooled the screening infantry and allowed the German army to get very close to the British tanks before they even knew they were under attack. They were given no choice but a desperate counterattack that, while it pushed back the German assault, left the British with only a dozen operable tanks. They knew that they could not possibly survive another attack. The Battle of Thala seemed to have been lost. At the end of their rope, the beleaguered defenders of Thala expected to be brushed aside in the morning, when, almost as if by miracle, a large column came up the road from Algeria. It was the divisional artillery for the American 9th Infantry Division, which was regrouping to the north and had called for their artillery train. The artillery had made an 800-mile forced march trying to rejoin their unit. But when they arrived in Thala, their commander, Brigadier General S. Leroy Irwin, appreciated how important the defense of Thala was, and so ignored his orders to go north and join the defense of Thala. In the morning, Rommel expected to brush aside dispirited forces, and instead was met by a massive artillery barrage from the combined British and American artillery. Concluding that the Allies must have received substantial reinforcements in the night, Rommel decided that he could not win the fight and withdrew. Not just from Thala, but short on fuel, he decided to push all the way back to southern Tunisia. Miraculously, the defenders of Thala, right at the point of their defeat, had emerged victorious. By the end of February, the Allies had retaken all of the ground that Rommel had gained in his offensive. And while Kasserine Pass was seen as a great defeat for the Americans, in the end the Allies had prevented that great breakthrough, so close to Rommel's grasp that could have changed the course of the war in North Africa. The defeats in the Tunisian campaign forced the Americans to make significant organizational and leadership changes, and even Rommel was impressed with how quickly the Americans learned their lessons. But that all would have been irrelevant if Rommel had taken the crossroads at Thala and pushed the Americans out of North Africa before they could even regroup. And yet, surprisingly, the defense of Thala is usually not much more than a footnote in any discussion of the Tunisian campaign. And that's too bad, because the valiant defenders of Thala, who fought an unequal battle with inferior equipment, deserve to be remembered.
Now for the fun part, where I, the history guy himself, and good friend of the history guy, Brad Wagnon, discuss what might have happened if it had all gone differently. So this is such a great story. It's a lot different, I think, in terms of the counterfactuals we've done, compared to, say, potatoes. This is a much more focused,
Okay, it is. Yeah, I mean, even for military counterfactuals in terms of this is some of those are like the whole war turns on it or something like this. This is just a turning point in a specific spot that would have tactically
Yeah.
affected things. So really, it gives you a chance to. I mean, this isn't like Can or something like that. I mean, or I mean others that we've talked about. And it really kind of gets you into the kind of the gritty details of a part of the battle. It's interesting to me because to me, when you look at Kasserine Pass, Thala is really the most interesting part of Kasserine Pass. But if you look at almost anything that's talking about Kasserine Pass, they barely
Yeah.
mention Thala. I mean, you can't even find if you look at a Battle of Thala, they don't even see it as a battle. It's just a little piece of because of course Kasserine Pass wasn't actually the Battle of Kasserine Pass. It was actually an offensive with a number of battles. But I mean, if there was a place where Kasserine Pass could have turned to true disaster, it was Thala. And I think it deserves to be remembered. I think we've got a better ability to sort of just really kind of dig into a gritty detail about what this would have meant than you can in a lot of the other ones. And it's a little bit harder because there's no forest there at all. I mean, there's no trees in that part of Tunisia. And so I think it'd be highly unlikely that Bigfoot would have been involved in any way.
That's true.
Unless he was with, unless he'd showed up with an Oregon, infantry detachment.
Yeah, you look at some of these pictures of this terrain, and it is extremely rocky. It does not look like the most fun to try to drive a tank over, quite honestly.
It's hard to imagine trying to fight across that, but it turned out to be very good defensive terrain because it was a series of ridge lines. A good part of war is terrain, is ground, and the ground. I mean, especially for when you're overwhelmed and you're just having to do a defense in depth and slow retreat and stuff like this is good for it. But you could also get inside these ridge lines. You could come up and then you'd be firing down the ridge line. So you could, once you broke through, you essentially had to abandon. It's almost like a trench line.
Well, the famous part of Kasserine Pass, of course, is that it was a disaster. That's the thing they want to talk about. Whenever you look it up, the things they really talk about are that the Americans totally fell apart, and it was all due to essentially inexperience. That the generals were inexperienced. They didn't choose the right ground. They didn't put the defensive. They didn't prepare the defensive correctly. And I think what's interesting about Thala is that it kind of shows where it, honestly, some of the strengths, first of all, of the Allied units that were there, and how they were able to kind of claw their way out of what had been a fairly significant defeat up until that point.
Yeah, because the other complaint about Kasserine Pass was that it was poorly coordinated between the Allies, which is the real question: could the Allies act together? And Thala was an example where the Allies managed to act together in extraordinary ways. So in a ways, it's different than the rest of the battle. I think I could say that's an unfair way to look at Kasserine, because Kasserine really what it was an offensive by Rommel. The offensive never achieved any of its goals. And within a matter of a couple of weeks after the battles, they had retaken all that ground. So it was a victory. It was an Allied victory. I mean, it was there was a major attack, and it not a surprise that in the major attack it took prisoners and it did damage, but it never achieved its goals, and then it ended up having to retreat. So I don't know if it's fair to say it was a huge defeat, but it's usually talked about as, the Americans learned how to get better command, and they did take a lot of people out of command and shift things around. And I think it's more interesting than that. I think it's more interesting than just the story that the Americans got beat and then they learned. I think that really kind of ignores a lot of what was going on in the battle.
Yeah, I am constantly surprised by, especially early in the war, how much of an old boys network the U.S. Army was, because we had such a small army coming into World War II. Essentially, Eisenhower, Patton, Bradley, they were all rubbing shoulders long before they even had the rank of general. So these were men who knew each other. And then Frendall is really kind of an outsider. He is not a graduate of West Point. But apparently he was competent enough at one point or another that someone decided that he needed general stars. That person actually was, drawing a blank, chief of U.S. Armed Forces.
Oh, Marshall?
Yeah, George C. Marshall, apparently.
Yeah.
Farrandall came into his attention. So that was kind of where he got his start. So
Yeah,
it's an interesting.
The U.S. military grew so quickly. So you had people who hadn't been getting promotions for years because the army had been kept small and there weren't a lot of opportunities, and so you had people that were colonels that were in their 50s, and then you also had this massive growth where you had people who had 90-day wonders, people who had no real experience, and that you have to have captains and majors and lieutenant colonels of whole new regiments. And it's not a surprise, too, that there was just not a lot of experience operating between the allies, too, coordinating and error and all that sort of thing. So, it wouldn't be a surprise coming into it that you would have some of the things that they talk about as being problems at Kasserine.
Well, and I think you would call them teething problems.
Yeah, well, virtually every officer there was untested. And so, some of them are going to perform well in combat and some of them aren't. And the Germans, on the other hand, have been fighting that war for 5-6 years. They are battle hardened. The Italians too.
Yeah, pretty much all the Axis forces there had been significantly involved in campaigns,
and the British forces too.
That's true. Yeah,
but this is that's why they hit to the American sector. But this is a case where the British role, because where they hit at Kasserine, the British role ends up being quite important, and their experience ends up being quite important.
Definitely. Another thing is, I like to look at some of the background. At this point, Rommel is no longer the undefeated Desert Fox, because at this point he has suffered the defeat of El Alamein, and he's his star is definitely losing some of its luster in German high command, and I think that actually ends up causing him problems with von Arnim, because von Arnim perhaps is looking at Rommel with not quite the same level of respect that he would have if Rommel still had that mantle of invulnerability that he had.
And that was they did have command problems, coordination problems, disagreement among command there. And so one of the arguments about Kasserine is that Rommel was not able to follow up as he might have because he didn't have that support. So it's a fair point. But another thing really to mention from the start too. This is February of 1943. This is late February of 1943. Early February of 1943 was the end of another battle, and on the Eastern Front, Stalingrad, and there are plenty of people who will argue that the German cause was lost after Stalingrad, which means the German cause was essentially lost about 2 weeks before this battle began. So when you talk about what are the effects of it, there are plenty of people who would argue, and I guess that we can get into that here, that the whole Tunisia campaign was just a sideshow, that it was a minuscule number of troops compared to the Eastern Front, that it was really an irrelevant fight after the loss at Stalingrad. And so I guess we get there. Did this battle even matter? In terms of a counterfactual, if this battle had gone any which way, would it have made a difference in the wider war?
It's interesting because the Africa campaign was not at the time totally insignificant, but when as history has looked at it, we don't talk a lot about the Africa campaign, especially the post-Torch Africa campaign, because of that. One of the things it definitely impacts, though, is in terms of the reach of this battle, there wasn't more people that Germany could have sent. There was, no matter what Rommel was able to do at this point, if he was able to break at Thala and push the Americans back, that was not there weren't resources for him. And that was a problem for Rommel throughout the whole war, is that the Africa, he never had the supplies and the troops that he wanted, because there was always a bigger front that the German high command wanted to focus on. But this does, it kind of shows, how, what was going on with the war effort, and, was it meaningless that we were still fighting in Africa? I think it's hard to say that. Ultimately, the whole underbelly campaign doesn't do what we want it to. But this was still, at this point when we're still, fighting in Tunisia, we still advance on that plan. We invade Sicily, we invade Italy. So it's not like we were, that there was no point. Because the Italian campaign certainly, it held up some veteran German units that could have made a difference somewhere. I don't know that they would have, you could argue about whether that would have changed the tide.
It turned out to be a difficult campaign too. But Tunisia was key to the Italian campaign, the soft underbelly. And so, to people who, I mean, I've had lots of people try to say, "Oh, the Russians really won the war. 9/10, every Germans that were killed, 9 were killed on the Russian front." But to me, if Stalin could have won the war without the Allies, he had every reason to. I mean, he knew the competition was coming already, and yet this whole period, Stalin is very desperately demanding a second front.
Second front now.
Yeah, and so I don't think so. I think Stalin knew that he was on the brink enough, that the Soviet Union was on the brink enough, that these other battles, even if they seem to be secondary fronts compared, I think Stalin knew that these were critical and important. I don't think that Stalin would have argued that Tunisia was irrelevant, or that the Italian campaign was irrelevant, because he was demanding the whole time for that to occur. So I think maybe that's a sign that the Soviet Union was closer to collapse than we seem to even admit. The fact that Stalin was willing to engage in the alliance that otherwise was not to his advantage, even at this point in the war. So I don't think it's irrelevant. Certainly Tunisia was key to Italy. And so, which I guess gets to another point here and say, what's the worst that could have happened at Thala? What's the worst case scenario for the Allies in terms of a counterfactual?
Yeah, I think that looking at the situation in North Africa, especially when we're getting into February of 43, in doing some research on this topic, it looks as if approximately a third of the supplies that were destined for North Africa were taken out via anti-shipping activity, via aircraft or naval. And so at no point was Rommel truly flush with fuel, unlimited fuel and unlimited munitions. He was always at the mercy of how much was getting through. So even if there is a huge turnaround, and I think that one of the counterfactuals that we will probably look into is, what if Rommel had not divided his forces to go after Thala and Tebessa, but had just focused on Tebessa as the headquarters of the Second Corps, and by all descriptions, a huge supply depot.
Mm-hmm. And he could have. I mean, that part of the idea was the whole idea of the bulge was that we'd be capturing Allied supply depots. So capturing these supply depots could have made a difference. So it's important, because sometimes the story is that Rommel ran out of gas, and it's not true. He actually had enough fuel supply for a couple 100 kilometers more fighting. What he ran out of was the thought that he was going to accomplish anything. But it's a fair point. If he's on top of these fuel depots, does that give him a much greater capacity to continue, moving in ways? They also had ammunition supply problems as well.
Yeah. And you also have to realize that at this point, Rommel is very nervous about the fact that the 8th Army is coming across North Africa through Libya and will be coming up from the south within a couple of weeks. Yeah. So he knows that this offensive has to be very quick, and he has to grab something and do enough damage to make it worthwhile.
So that's another of the sort of assumptions about this battle that people will do, is that it really didn't make a difference too, because the Allies had enough force in it that it wasn't going to change the Tunisian campaign. So in terms of a counterfactual, the first question is, did Thala really make a difference? Would it have made it? Maybe the whole North African campaign was irrelevant because of Stalingrad. Maybe Kasserine Pass was irrelevant because the Allies had already won in Tunisia. And I think that, given how desperate the situation was at Thala, it's hard to say, because at very least, if he takes Thala, he cuts off the entire U.S. 9th Infantry Division. He cuts off the 1st Armored Division's Combat Team BCCB, and those are significant losses. So for this to have been a disaster that really changed the war, it would have been that it so demoralized America this early in the war, or so caused a lack of faith between the British and the Americans, that it long-term affected our confidence to be able to continue the campaign. And I don't think that's out of the question. But I don't think it's going to be that he's going to drive his tanks through and then make it all the way back to Tunisia.
Yeah, hard to imagine.
Possible that early in the war, though, or is it possible that early in the war that he could have inflicted a defeat so severe, tens of thousands of POWs, whole army groups having to surrender, splitting the commands between the British and the Americans, etc., that he could have caused a lack of faith, a retreat from Tunisia.
Oh, and he did do significant damage. The British, especially like Montgomery, lost a lot of respect in the Americans because of this battle. And Montgomery essentially had thought the Americans were bad soldiers for the rest of the war because of what happened here, which again I don't think is probably all that fair given how the situation turned out.
He also thought he won the Battle of the Bulge too, so that's not.
Well,
it's Montgomery.
Yeah, Montgomery.
Yeah. Now here's an interesting counterfactual. What if the Americans are defeated so badly that ultimately commander of Schaeff ends up being British and possibly even Monty himself, as opposed to Eisenhower?
Yeah,
and I think
and that's interesting because their personality is so different. I think it certainly would have made Eisenhower was the more policy. It would have made coordination difficult. Yeah. That's a fair point. That's an interesting counterfactual there. Yeah. What if it caused because it did cause change in command. Kasserine Pass did, but what if it caused a change in command all the way up to that level? Because if the British had lost faith,
that's some significant damage. It is. Maybe we're I don't think we're necessarily a big Montgomery fans as a group, but it does seem like it would alter who was in command was significant. Mm-hmm. And that might happen if we lose at Thala. I think that, they choose to push back or to pull out of Thala, partially because they knew that the artillery, that came with an infantry mm-hmm. division. They did not know that artillery had arrived without their infantry division.
Yeah. Well, you can see why in the morning he's thought, wow, they had to have been significantly reinforced for this much noise to be going on. So
they weren't as reinforced as he thought.
Stafford Irwin, who's a name that nobody I think particularly remembers out of the war. So if he followed orders, then he wouldn't have been there. And Stafford Irwin appreciated the situation without any orders from anybody above him and said, no, we're going to park here because this is more important. And that's, I think that deserves to be remembered too. And it does say that, again, you don't want to do a great man theory, but one person who just thought a little bit differently, who was in command, and again, like we were talking about, nobody, the way the command structure was tested, that he made a very good decision. And that certainly made a difference, at least on the last day of the battle at Thala. That had to be pretty darn scary with that amount of artillery raining down on you after the day. But they came very close in the night attack, which is before the artillery could have been placed. I think they might have been starting to arrive by then. But had they broken through with that night attack and gotten in behind lines, they might have been catching this artillery train, unprepared. So there's they'll say, I think Wikipedia, in the entire Kasserine Pass, I think Wikipedia has about one paragraph on Thala. It is just barely says, and they'll say the British bent, but they didn't break, and I don't think they mention how bent it was right there, and just some American units that were in retreat and a fairly small British force compared to what they were running into. Yeah,
it was remarkable because it was totally a battle put together force. This Nick force that they put together. It was just whatever they could throw at them, and so it was incredible that they held. It is, but they barely.
Yeah, they did. Their armor was so outmatched, and that's that. They talk about. First of all, the gap on Montgomery, we know exactly how wide the gap is. All you have to do is measure the Atlantic Ocean, and that's how big the gap is. That measures whether you love or don't love Monty, by and large. But early in the war, the British will tell you that the 2-pounder was the best anti-tank or the best tank gun ever made. And by 1943, the 2-pounder is not that much. The Valentine's an interesting tank, but it had a fairly small turret ring, and so it never really managed to mount a bigger gun was its problem. But those Valentine infantry tanks were by 1943. Were outmatched, and it was the 17th, 24th who have so much history too, That's interesting to me because these are the guys that fought at Omdurman and the 24th Lancers so these are storied regiments that are fighting there, but they really were, fighting against odds. They had to be, very close range for their 2-pounders to be effective, and they did it. They went and fought
at terrible cost. They just they couldn't have held in the morning after without.
Yeah. I mean, they knew they were going to be overrun. I mean, they were all figuring they'd be dead or prisoners by the end of the next day.
Yeah, and that just goes back to British tanks in World War II were very hit or miss, and that's part of their operational strategy was that they had specific design goals in mind for the tank, and having the tank hunt other tanks and some of the assumptions they made about how that hunting would go definitely did hamstring them in the long run. Up until the Comet, and of course the Sherman Firefly. British tanks are, typically they're under armored and undergunned. Even the 6-pounder is essentially a 57 millimeter, and that's just not where your main gun on the tanks that your opposition is carrying. And what you really want are 75 millimeter, 88 millimeter guns that can penetrate armor at a good distance.
I mean, the Valentine's an interesting tank, and they're still using it. I mean, Valentine's for a D-Day, right? But for a reason. But I mean, in this case, this is not the ideal armored force that you would want to be countering an attack by the whole, 10th Panzer.
Yeah, especially in such small numbers. I believe the number of Valentines was at 13.
They were reduced to that at one point, but it wasn't a large number of vehicles. Yeah, they were always outnumbered, and then they were always outgunned too. But in terms Rommel's goal, his goal in the whole offensive was to destroy the British 5 Corps and destroy America 2 Corps, and then to essentially drive the British from Tunisia. That was very those are stretch goals, but had he done that, had he driven the Allies from Tunisia, captured a large part of their supply, cut off large groups of troops from their supply, managed a large, take a large number of prisoners, and I guess in the farthest extreme, gotten all the way back to taking ports up in North Africa. If he'd essentially removed the Allies from Tunisia, then it probably delays. It certainly delays the Italian campaign, but there's a good chance it ends up delaying D-Day by at least a year,
that's significant. Those weeks and months. If you wonder how much Russia could take. How desperate he was for a second front. They had spent years every summer just losing millions. And something like 20 million Russians are captured, and how many whole Russian army groups can get completely cut off and captured before your morale just totally collapses.
Yeah, even after Stalingrad, they were still taking massive losses. Yeah,
Kursk was after Stalingrad, and Kursk was not the Soviets held, but there was a moment at Kursk where the Germans were not it was not outside the realm of possibility that the Germans could make a difference there, and if there was a little bit of pressure removed from another front, maybe that's all they would have needed. It was Kursk was not like super close, but it was close. And the Germans, if the Germans had defeated the Russian army at Kursk, you wonder what would have gone on elsewhere. I don't know. Could they have taken that big of a loss again?
If you had the Afrika Corps at Kursk, it certainly could have shifted the balance. The question is, could the Afrika Corps had shifted the balance in Africa?
Yeah.
If the Germans won the whole North Africa campaign, how does that change the war? It's kind of
because it's imagining. What you lose with that is you lose control of the Mediterranean, which was important, which mattered,
and you largely lose the connection between the UK and India and Australia. It would have been extremely different.
Even that late in the war, if it had gone on. But part of you wonder if he defeated the Americans and the British in the West, could Rommel have turned around and beaten the Eighth Army, or would it, or even held the Eighth Army off? And I don't know that.
I will say that, to the points that you've previously made, if you want an example of just how desperate things were in the Soviet Union, you have to remember that Operation Uranus failed. The Germans were able to cut off an entire Soviet army group in southern Russia, even after Stalingrad. So they're still an effective fighting force on the Eastern Front. And with leadership and enough supplies, the Germans will continue to be tenacious, and they will make the Russians pay for every inch of territory that they're trying to take back. Secondly, I think that this does bode well to another nameless individual who came up with the idea that assassinating Hitler was actually a really bad idea, because the operational decisions he was making were directly hurting the Germans. So the entire concept of not one step back. First practiced so effectively by Stalin during the early part of the Eastern Front campaign, which ended in disaster. For some reason, Hitler decided that, I'll just do it the right way and tell my not to retreat. Now, would Hitler have ever thought possibly that after a victory at Thala, the Americans are reeling, the British are having second thoughts about this erstwhile ally, the United States, and they begin to take the 250,000-ish troops from North Africa, pull them onto the continent, and really
losing it.
In fact, he wouldn't let them retreat.
Yeah, losing the Africa Corps was not insignificant, because you're right. Compared to the Eastern Front, it was a small number of guys, but they were battle hardened. They were veteran. Even if it just buys them enough time to pull enough of the Africa Corps out, that there's some significant parts of some of those divisions involved elsewhere. I mean, that could have made a difference. It's hard to see.
So we're ignoring the Italians too.
Yeah, and the Italians. That's true.
I mean, it essentially removes Italy from the combat, or from the war, or makes a big difference. So
there's another counterfactual here, and that is that the defeat of Rommel, well, maybe not the defeat of Rommel, but the stalemating of Rommel, who is not able to follow up on Kasserine Pass, that definitely does make the Italian exit from the war much easier. Whereas if the Axis had been more successful, would Italy have held on, say, for even another 6 to 8 months? At minimum, you can say that it would have meant a lot more loss of life in North Africa for the Allies. If it had extended the war. I mean, I think that the farthest you could possibly argue is that a very significant victory here might have made the Italian campaign impossible, or at least impossible for like another 2 years.
Yeah.
So if it weren't for the Italian campaign, is Germany able to finally break Russia in that time? How important was the Italian campaign? Again, some people argue it was irrelevant. Stalingrad was already over, and really ended up being a meat grinder in the Italian campaign. But if you think the Italian campaign was relevant to the war, then you could say that Thala and Kasserine Pass were possibly quite relevant to the Italian campaign, and the ability to prosecute that campaign when we did. It
is because if you try to think back and you're like, okay, without the Italian campaign, does the war, do the Allies lose the war? And I think that's a difficult argument. I think there'd be a lot of arguing there, debate around that, but. The Italians exiting the campaign, and the number of again, veteran German units that end up having to move south and defend Italy. What the question there ends up being, who lost more from our commitment of forces there? Did the Germans lose more committing their forces, or did the Allies lose more committing those forces?
Their forces, yeah.
And it feels like the Germans lost more there.
Yeah.
That was more precious to them.
Other thing that's important there is the 15th Air Force having those bases in Italy allowed attacks on things like the Czechoslovakian oil fields and et cetera. So I mean, if anything, the Italian campaign is important because it gives us that where we're flying. That was where we're flying massive amounts of airplanes out of Italy that we wouldn't have been able to do if we had lost Tunisia.
I kind of feel like the Italian campaign, because we didn't. it was not the knockout punch that we wanted it to be, and it was compared to what our hopes for it were. It was extremely disappointing, and I feel like that's kind of impacted
the
how
was not soft.
Yeah. I think it's impacted, our kind of view of the whole strategy, and it's I don't think totally fairly, because I think that still there were important things that we gained from the Italian campaign, and it does get harder to say, could we have beaten the Axis if we just ignored that campaign, if we ignored that entire theater altogether. And there were important pieces of that theater. It was important that they held some part of Africa, and control of the Mediterranean, which really shifted once North Africa was in the hands of the Allies, was not insignificant.
It was not insignificant. Well, the other question there too is that because the choice was to attack Italy or attack Greece. I mean, they could have also attacked it in the Western Med, and I guess it leaves another interesting question in terms of another place that was kind of important during the war. But if there had been a significant delay, if this had put the Allies in a position that Tunisia doesn't fall for another year, does Malta fall?
Malta might have. I mean, maybe that was they were hanging on. Malta was always, of course, rather. A tricky position.
If they had done the parachute attack that they planned, they almost certainly would have won. Malta was, not. It would have been outgunned fairly quickly, and they were always able to
It's off topic, but the German paratrooper attack at Crete and the fact that it didn't go the way the Germans, as well as the Germans hoped for, had some significant impact on that. I mean, they really lost their faith in the whole concept of paratroopers.
Yeah, I mean, but a battle for Malta could have been interesting. I mean, because Malta essentially had been bombed almost flat by that point. Yeah. But I mean, that's part of the Mediterranean. That was part of the reasons that was so critical that we were taking. I mean, you're right. North Africa was about controlling the Suez. It was maybe about oil fields. Certainly, that could be in terms of connecting. The reason the British thought it was important is because this was their connection to the empire, the most important part of the empire, India. But it really was also about the Mediterranean. And you're right. If they continue to hold Tunisia, then they hold the Mediterranean. And if you can hold the Mediterranean, then you can supply your Africa core.
Ultimately, Africa never supplied they were always hoping it was going to be a raw materials. And there's something to be said that the Axis getting involved in North Africa to begin with,
which is an interesting counterfactual to say. What if there was never the attack on Africa? Would the war have gone differently if those resources had been used elsewhere?
That's an interesting.
It leaves you a question too. I mean, this is way off topic here, but what if? I mean, Operation Sea Lion always seemed, kind of far-fetched. And they simply didn't have that amphibious capability. So what if you don't do the Battle of Britain? What if you take those 1,000 aircraft from the Luftwaffe and use them on Russia instead? I mean, is Britain after Dunkirk in any position to do anything, despite the fact that you're bombing the tar out of them? So what if the whole difference in the campaign is to say, what if the counterfactual is to say that Germany was never going to keep Tunisia, and what if they'd use those resources somewhere else? And could that have shifted the war?
Yeah, I do think the Battle of Britain was a very close thing, and then the strategic bombing of Germany. It just never really had the results, especially early on, that they were hoping that it would. They really had to perfect that. And when you had significant fighter cover coming in, the daylight raids were almost suicidal. And even the night raids, they were taking heinous losses. So, yeah, I can see where additional air units preventing any sort of real development of the strategic bombing of Germany, as well as additional air power on the Eastern Front. That definitely could have made the fighting there even tougher than it already was.
I mean, Stalingrad was a close thing. And so what if those resources had been there? If you just kind of assume that after Dunkirk, the British are going to take a while to do anything, also the Battle of the Atlantic, right? What if your entire U-boat fleet is covering the Baltic, keeping you from taking anything to Russia? rather than trying to fight its way all the way across
that fighting against England did take a lot of resources away from the Germans, and you wonder if the Germans had focused on, say, just defensive operations. It's hard to imagine that after Dunkirk, England would have been all that capable of large, offensive operations, especially if the Germans, instead of, trying to maintain superiority over the Channel and the Great Britain, are just defending mainland Europe. That makes it awfully difficult to want to send your bombers when you're already in desperate shape. Mm-hmm. And that's a significant question. Of course, we are getting pretty far off of Thala specifically.
But in terms of the counterfactual here is that what if Rommel hadn't been at Thala? What if Rommel had been at Stalingrad or at Kursk?
Rommel had he was especially noted for his maneuverability, his mobile warfare, and that was Russia across those steppes. And that's it's true that Stalingrad was close enough that if you could have devoted more of those the U-boat squadrons to keeping the absolutely necessary supplies. Stalingrad held on because we were getting supplies into Stalingrad. If you're able to cut off, even a significant portion of that starts to make things look pretty dicey.
So if Russia collapses, if at some point the Soviet Union actually does collapse, and they were across the Volga, that's not outside. If there's a major defeat at Stalingrad, take Moscow or whatever, if they're pushed back behind the Urals to try to build their tanks back there, all the other things they're talking about. If you really come to a collapse of the Soviet Union, which of course there was, Russia collapsed in the First World War. If you come to a collapse in the Soviet Union in 1943. Because you didn't contest Africa, because you weren't engaging in the Battle of Britain, because you're realizing it's going to take Americans and British a long time before they can attack anything. So you just defend Fortress Europe, and you take those resources there and you apply them, and you cause Russia to collapse. What do the British and American allies do? Is there a point where you negotiate peace with Hitler, or are we fighting essentially over Russia? And there are trees in Russia, so that it is possible that Bigfoot could have been involved.
Bigfoot got involved on the Eastern Front. Yeah. That's the
maybe if we move the whole fight.
I'm thinking Bigfoot. I'm thinking that the Bigfoot would have been denizens of Karelia, up near the Finnish order. So Bigfoot might have been forced to help the defenders at Leningrad, or perhaps the attackers.
We don't know the political stances of the Bigfoots.
We don't know. Yeah.
And maybe some of them disagree. Maybe we would have a Bigfoot civil
war. Maybe
war.
There were Bigfoots on both sides. That is true. There is an African Bigfoot. What's it called? It's called a Kulukamba, but it's in the jungle parts, and that's just not what was fought here. So
I've never heard of a desert dwelling Bigfoot.
Yeah, I think that would have been far out of place to pop up at Thala.
Yeah. So here's a couple of thoughts. If Thala falls, and again there is political fallout to the point where American generals are not trusted, then we perhaps see minor roles for generals such as Omar Bradley, George S. Patton, and Mark Clark. I'm not sure that less of a role for him is necessarily a bad idea, but.
But you're right. So the important generals, American generals there in Western Europe, cut their teeth there in North Africa. And what if they don't get the chance to do that because American command is just so disgraced?
Yeah, and they mattered, of course. And you look at the history of it; those are the names that come up because they were the names that were leading, in those fights.
So we just start. We have wandered a ways away, and but if they had taken Thala, which was a very close thing, it was very much quite possible. You just have to look at it and say this is a battle that could have gone the other way. That cuts off the 9th Infantry Division. If the U.S. has the entire 9th Infantry Division, it's cut off and forced to surrender en masse. How much does that impact? Because it's 1943. We're barely into this war. How much does this, especially since we're not doing too well in the Pacific at this point?
No.
How much does that affect American morale? And
not the whole point, but one of the points in attacking Africa was that they needed good news. They were hopeful to get, and I mean, I can't think of a comparable loss actually for the Americans in the war at all, of a whole division like that.
Yeah, I mean, there were regiments, but not a whole division. And I mean, does that mean that FDR loses re-election? Does that mean that the U.S. shifts towards isolationism again, or shifts our goal to the Pacific instead of Europe?
Do we decide that it's just too great a cost? And that certainly that's not outside the realm of possibility. There were people in the U.S. arguing that very thing.
Mm-hmm.
That it wasn't our job, that it was going to cost too many American lives for things that weren't our problem. Those were not unfair or unthought of points, and it's potential. What we learned there was important, but you have to be able to take what you learned and use it. And if the political fallout is significant,
if you lose the people, you lose a war. I mean, it totally depends. So, would it have hardened our resolve like the Battle of Britain did, or was our resolve, dicey at that point? Because Kasserine Pass was seen as a disaster and a defeat.
Yeah.
Imagine what it would have been, because we know that the 9th Infantry Division, which was just trying to regroup, would have been cut off from its supply. Potentially, if they caught that artillery, on the road, lost all their equipment. Rommel's taking, fuel supply depots that we need to supply, then potentially there's significant losses at a time could the Allies have withstood a significant loss and kept going? Because it's honest, so casual where they're kind of like, it didn't make a difference. We had the advantage then to the point where it wouldn't have made a difference, and I'm not sure that that's true. I'm not sure that it wouldn't have made a difference.
Yeah, I think that in the grand scheme of things, probably what have happened is that America would have had to pull back and retrench a bit. We would have seen the same or a very similar alignment of new commanders. And Patton was kind of the next guy in line. So Patton in North Africa, I think, would still probably happen. However, it's very possible that what would happen is that the American doctrine would be changed to more closely match the British doctrine. And if we use Montgomery as an example, Montgomery was a planner and was very methodic. And so instead of kind of these, bigger than life, Patton running essentially all the way from France through Central Europe in just a few weeks, what if he's basically put on a leash? And he's only allowed to attack when the proper supplies have been put in place and the equipment is there and the men are lined up.
That's again our American bias coming out here. If it had been Montgomery, would we have lost? But I mean, look at
there are some people who will vociferously disagree with that.
Yeah, look at him crossing the Rhine there. I don't know. He's revered in the UK, and to be fair, but that's a good question. He was a much more cautious commander. And matter of fact, Alexander was making that argument to the British General Alexander, was that you needed Patton in charge instead of Montgomery because he wanted someone that would attack.
Yeah, and Montgomery is not it. It's despite having grown up on a steady diet of the movie Patton, Montgomery is not an incompetent commander.
Well, and certainly he improves the British performance in North Africa almost immediately. And but it is true that
we did episodes on that.
He's kind of sort of famous for waiting until he has overwhelming numbers and then attacking with his overwhelming numbers. Yeah, he's not what you would call daring.
Yeah. At the same time, he is extremely successful, and he is the man who beats Rommel. So you cannot take that away from him. So the fact that the British revere Montgomery, I can understand. Because he was not a bad commander. However, is he the type of commander that you need when Germany is beginning to fall apart, men and material are becoming scarce enough that you have opportunities to basically do a Hail Mary run around the edge and take significant portions of territory. And Patton was
it's like when you have a famous movie and you hear that another actor had originally, been chosen for that role, and you wonder how different that movie would have been. Was Eisenhower absolutely critical to the Allied success in Europe? I mean, was there another personality could do that? If Kasserine had gone differently, might that have impacted whether it was an American there, or whether they pulled Marshall over because Marshall wanted to go? The FDR was trying to stop him. So I guess where I'm trying to put it here is that this battle, which is I think not considered as much as it should be, that I think was really the most desperate point really of the Battle of Kasserine, and there's just this kind of attitude that like, Kasserine. We had the force there that we would have won anyway. Kasserine, it really wasn't a defeat because we took it back. They were out of gas. And I think that it's too casual. I think in terms of a counterfactual, the fall of Thala could have had significant ramifications. It could impact the wider war and could have impacted American elections and certainly would have meant a lot more death, both in Tunisia and possibly in Italy.
Well, and when we start every one of these episodes, I've got a bit that talks about kind of the concept of a counterfactual, which is what can we learn about what did happen from talking about what didn't, and to some extent you can see how decisions that the Germans had made from the beginning of the war and other Axis powers as well, how that was impacting how the war was going to go from then on. And so, you can see that there was, there were Allied reinforcements on the way. The Germans were unable to dedicate significant reinforcements to Africa, but were unwilling to pull those forces out. All of that kind of leads to what happens ultimately, and that at least hinged a little bit on what happened at Thala. And what was there of the 10th Panzer Division? I think there's almost no question that if they had decided to attack and had really tried to push through, the artillery would have made it a more difficult fight. But I think they would have broken through. By the end of the day, they were already from. I was reading some stuff that showed they were low on ammo. They had used much of their ammo, and they were they had. I mean, we had used everything we could against them, which I think was the only decision because that was what convinced them to pull out. Anyway, was just the volume of fire. You had to keep them thinking that we had enough ammo to keep doing it, even though we didn't. And that's how close that was. And
that's what's cool about this. Isn't midway, right? I mean, this is a battle that gets one paragraph in Wikipedia that you can look at and say, and as it doesn't even have its own page. It gets one paragraph in the page of another. This really shows how that granular fight really could have impacted the wider war. I think that makes Thala really, really interesting.
This wasn't going to alter probably the condition of the world today, but it certainly could have caused significant impacts at the war. And I mean, even if you just lengthen the war by even a handful of months, you might be having some significant,
at least many thousands of lives. Soldiers.
At least many thousands of lives, each of which matters and makes a difference. And I think that when we're able to look at such small granular things, you can see how sometimes I think we feel like we're not to be too preachy about that, but we don't feel like we do a lot. But every little thing adds up to be a bigger part of this bigger picture.
For want of a nail, a shoe was lost. And it's too easy sometimes to say, things were just going to work out the way things were going to work out. We were going to win in North Africa because we had more, we had overwhelming force or whatever, and to say that there really were spots, that it could have changed something. I think this is one of those. I think this is a bigger hinge point than people realize because it was so close. For the strategic spot, so that they just kind of say, well, it didn't break, but there's not a lot of, well, do you know how close they were? When you say bent but didn't break, they were awfully bent, and what could that have meant?
Because they want to talk about that even if it broke there, that there were other Allied forces, and I mean it wouldn't have necessarily meant the end of the North African campaign, but I agree that it's hard to say just, there were other reinforcements coming. And how those reinforcements arrive and where they end up defending, mattered, whether we held Thala or not. And, if Thala had fallen and they had pushed forward another, 200 kilometers, that might have made the difference. We might not have retaken that ground in a couple of weeks.
Mm-hmm. And, what could that have meant in terms of the length of the war? To just say, casually say, Tunisia was going to work out the way it did anyway, is just like casually saying that after Stalingrad, the war was essentially over. An awful lot of people died after Stalingrad.
Yeah, right. I'm going to say none of those sacrifices were,
And that you could just
The
go back and
effects of the
say, well,
war.
when you look at the number of tanks that Stalin had in the end, Germany was always going to lose the war. Well, that's easy to say. It's not. Germany could have not done well in the first part of the war, and it might have been a small war. I mean, it was really kind of a surprise how well Germany did in the Battle of France and stuff like that. So, but it didn't. It worked out the way that it worked out. So, I think it's trying to just kind of mechanistically say, no, this doesn't matter. I think when you really get down to where it was, it did, and probably another 100 other places that we never really thought of that were closer than we realize could have made a difference truly in the outcomes. As I always say as a history guy, I always say history is history. It did happen, and that's what we got. Some of the battles that we talk about, I mean, good golly, the whole world could have changed. And that's easy to say. And this is not one of those. This is one to say, well, how much could it have changed things? Well, probably not the outcome of the war, but possibly some large ripple effects. Maybe if Eisenhower is not commander of SHAEF, then is Eisenhower president of the United States? I think obviously not, right?
And that certainly alters that's whether you want to call Eisenhower an impactful president or not. Someone like we've said before, just someone different being in that position is world altering.
Yeah, definitely. And there's a very good argument that Eisenhower was the right man at the right place at the right time. If you look at how many of these battles do we start with, where von Arnim and Rommel are arguing about who gets the bulk of the 10th Panzer Division. And the Allies had much the same problem. Not just Monty and Patton, even though, the movie makes the point. But you can make a pretty good argument that every general at every level, whether it was, regimental, all the way up to entire army groups or air corps, were fighting for whatever resources they could get. And Eisenhower was a master at being able to balance out those voices and present compromises in such a way that it was palatable to both sides. Because I can quite honestly see, we see it in every war. My favorite one to refer back to is the American Civil War. There's a conflict that is rife with political appointees and brilliant generals and everything in between, and they are all crying for their piece of the pie at a particular time. And the personality conflicts between those generals oftentimes were a matter of victory or defeat. And I think that Eisenhower played his hand very, very well.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the History Guy podcast. We hope you enjoyed this episode of Counterfactual History, and if you did, you can find lots more history if you follow The History Guy on YouTube. You can also find us at thehistoryguy.com, Facebook, Patreon, and Locals. If you want to hear more Counterfactuals, stay tuned. We release podcasts every 2 weeks.